Jamila and Marcus Parker had spent the last 5 years building their dream home in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Crestwood. After years of hard work, late nights, and sacrifices, the family finally had a place they could call their own. The house was modest but welcoming: 3 bedrooms, a spacious backyard, and a large kitchen where Jamila could prepare her favorite meals for her 2 children, Isaiah and Kayla. The walls of their home held laughter, shared meals, and the promise of a better future. Marcus worked as a manager at a local tech company, while Jamila balanced her work as a graphic designer with the demands of raising 2 young children. It wasn't easy, but they were making it work. The Parkers were proud of how far they had come. Their new neighborhood, while predominantly white, seemed like the perfect place to raise their family. Quiet, peaceful, and safe, or so they thought. The first few months in Crestwood had been mostly uneventful. Their neighbors were polite, nodding in acknowledgement as they passed each other in the street. Most of the time, Jamila and Marcus kept to themselves, focused on their work and their family. But there was one neighbor, Mr. Samuelson, who always seemed to stare a little too long whenever he passed their house. At first, Jamila brushed it off. It was easy to convince herself that it was just her imagination. But over time, his glances became more pointed, more uncomfortable. One afternoon, as Marcus and Jamila were sitting outside on their porch, watching Kayla and Isaiah play in the yard, they saw Mr. Samuelson walking his dog down the street. He paused at the edge of their driveway, eyeing them with an expression Jamila couldn't quite place. She felt a shiver run down her spine. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked, noticing her tense posture. "I don't know," Jamila replied, her voice low. "Something about the way he looks at us. It doesn't feel right." Before Marcus could respond, the sharp sound of a car pulling up interrupted them. A police cruiser rolled to a stop at the curb. Jamila's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at Marcus, but his expression was unreadable. The officer got out of the car and walked toward them. "Good afternoon," the officer said, his tone polite but formal. "We received a call about a disturbance. Something about a suspicious activity in the area." Jamila's stomach churned. A disturbance? There had been no disturbance, just a quiet afternoon with her family. She turned to Marcus, her eyes filled with confusion and growing concern. "Who called?" Marcus asked, standing up to face the officer. "Your neighbor," the officer replied, gesturing toward Mr. Samuelson, who was standing at the end of the driveway with his dog, watching them. But little did they know, this encounter would change everything. The officer's presence was a shock, but what happened next was even more unexpected. As the officer turned to acknowledge Mr. Samuelson's complaint, another car pulled up behind the cruiser, a black sedan with tinted windows. The vehicle slowed to a stop, and the door opened. Out stepped a tall woman, her expression determined as she approached the officer. She was dressed in a professional but casual outfit, a dark green jacket and black jeans, and her hair was tied back in a neat ponytail. There was an air of authority about her, but also a calmness that immediately put Jamila at ease. "Is everything all right here?" the woman asked, walking toward the officer. Her voice was steady, confident, but not confrontational. The officer looked slightly taken aback, clearly unsure of how to respond. We received a call about a suspicious activity. Just making sure everything's okay." The woman glanced briefly at the officer, then shifted her gaze to Mr. Samuelson, who had crossed his arms and was watching them with a wary expression. "I'm Officer Taylor," the woman said, holding out her hand. "I'm with the local community outreach division. I noticed you were all gathered out here, and I thought I'd come see if there were any issues." The officer seemed hesitant but shook her hand. "There's a misunderstanding. We received a call about a disturbance, but it looks like everything's fine." "Disturbance?" Officer Taylor's eyebrow arched in disbelief, and her voice remained calm but firm. "Are you sure? It looks like a family enjoying an afternoon." Perhaps Mr. Samuelson could clarify what he saw that caused concern. The tension in the air was palpable. Jamila, Marcus, and even the children, who had paused playing, were watching this exchange with quiet anticipation. There was something about Officer Taylor's demeanor that felt right. She wasn't raising her voice, but she wasn't backing down either. She was simply allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Mr. Samuelson hesitated before speaking. He began but faltered under Officer Taylor's direct gaze. He quickly regained his composure. I've been noticing some unfamiliar people coming and going at their house. At odd hours, too. It's just unsettling. Unfamiliar people? Officer Taylor asked, taking a step forward. Could you elaborate? People who don't belong in the neighborhood, Mr. Samuelson muttered, a defensive edge creeping into his tone. Officer Taylor glanced at Jamila and Marcus, her expression softening. I see. So, your concern is based on unfamiliar faces. Has anyone seen any actual illegal activity? No, Mr. Samuelson mumbled, clearly uncomfortable. The officer let out a deep breath, clearly frustrated. It sounds like what you're describing is just a difference in appearances, Mr. Samuelson. This isn't a case of suspicious activity. Everyone deserves respect and safety in their own home, especially when no laws are being broken. Jamila felt a wave of relief wash over her, but also a growing admiration for Officer Taylor. There was something reassuring about how she handled the situation, how she spoke to Mr. Samuelson without raising her voice, how she defused the situation with professionalism and empathy. It wasn't just about handling the situation, it was about ensuring fairness. Marcus turned to Officer Taylor, his expression softening. Thank you for coming. I didn't think we'd need to involve the police, but I appreciate you handling it like this. Of course, she said with a reassuring smile. I'm glad we could clear that up. No one should ever feel unwelcome in their own home, especially when they haven't done anything wrong. The kids, who had been watching the exchange in silence, now relaxed, and Isaiah, always the more vocal of the two, stepped forward. Are you like a superhero or something? He asked, his eyes wide with awe. Officer Taylor chuckled, bending down to his level. Not quite a superhero, but I do my best to help out when I can. Jamila couldn't help but smile, but the way Officer Taylor handled the situation left her feeling deeply grateful. She had expected to deal with an uncomfortable situation where they were forced to justify their existence in their own neighborhood. Instead, she had witnessed something rare. Someone who didn't back down when faced with injustice, but also didn't escalate the situation unnecessarily. Officer Taylor had seen the root of the issue, understood the complexity, and had made sure to keep the peace without giving in to bias. Thank you, Jamila said softly, finally finding her voice. You really helped today. Officer Taylor stood up, her smile warm. It's my job, but it's also about being human. Just look out for each other, all right? With that, Officer Taylor turned, gave a short nod to the officer who had initially arrived, and headed back to her car, leaving behind a sense of calm. As she drove off, Jamila and Marcus exchanged a glance. Despite everything, despite Mr. Samuelson's misplaced fears, the experience had reinforced something important. They weren't just fighting for space in a neighborhood, they were fighting for their right to exist without fear or judgment. And Officer Taylor's quiet but firm response had shown them that there were people who stood with them. The encounter had opened their eyes. It wasn't just about getting through the day. It was about realizing that standing up for what was right sometimes meant having the courage to face uncomfortable truths, and knowing there were people willing to help, to stand beside you. That small, simple act of kindness, by someone who didn't need to make a grand statement but simply acted with decency, was the true measure of strength. As the police cruiser pulled away, leaving the quiet hum of the neighborhood to settle back into its usual stillness, Jamila stood on the porch, her hands trembling slightly. The encounter had shaken her more than she expected. Marcus stood beside her, his brow furrowed, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he processed the events. I didn't expect that, Marcus finally said, his voice low. A call to the police? Over nothing. Jamila glanced at him, her thoughts tangled. It's not just nothing, Marcus. It's the kind of thing that happens when people like us move into spaces where we're not expected to be. She looked toward Mr. Samuelson's house across the street, the curtains drawn, as if shielding his eyes from what he had perceived as a threat. Marcus sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I know. After everything we've worked for, it feels like it doesn't matter. It feels like we don't belong. Jamila's heart twisted at the truth in his words. They had worked so hard to build their life here, in this neighborhood, a place where they had hoped to escape the constant undercurrent of tension they had faced in other parts of town. But this incident, this call to the police, had exposed something painful. No matter how much they succeeded, no matter how much they achieved, there would always be people who saw them as outsiders. Tension bubbled in her chest as she thought about the look on Mr. Samuelson's face, the way he had held himself as though he had every right to question their presence. She had tried to dismiss it, to tell herself that it was just an isolated incident. But deep down, the feeling gnawed at her. How many other times had they been watched, judged, and criticized simply because of their skin color? "I'm tired, Marcus," Jamila said, her voice quieter now, vulnerable. "Tired of feeling like we have to prove ourselves. Tired of the sideways glances, the whispers behind closed doors." Marcus stepped closer, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "We don't have to prove anything to anyone. We're doing our best and we're making it. We're good people." "I know, but it doesn't always feel like enough," Jamila whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "I try to ignore it. I try to just focus on the good, on the family we're building. But moments like this remind me of everything we still have to fight against." There was a long silence as Jamila looked out at the street, the neighborhood that had once felt welcoming now feeling distant, almost foreign. She wanted to be proud of the home they had created, proud of their success, but the weight of racial injustice seemed to follow her wherever she went. The truth was, no matter how far she had come, there were still forces at work that sought to undermine everything they had worked for. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approached from behind. Jamila turned to see Officer Taylor walking back toward them, her boots crunching against the gravel of the driveway. She was holding a cup of coffee in her hands, a small gesture that immediately made Jamila feel seen. "You know," Officer Taylor said, as she came to stand next to them, "I didn't expect that either. To be honest, I've seen situations like this before, and I wasn't sure how it would turn out. But what I saw here, how you handled it, tells me a lot about you." Jamila frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Officer Taylor continued, her tone calm and measured, "you didn't let it escalate. You didn't raise your voice or react with hostility. You held your ground and you stayed calm. A lot of people would have been angry, and they would have had every right to be. But you handled yourself with grace. That's something not everyone can do." Jamila felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at the officer, the warmth in her words bringing unexpected comfort. For the first time since the encounter, she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a strength in handling things the way they did. Yes, it was painful and unfair to have to deal with people like Mr. Samuelson, but she had not let his actions define her. She had not let his prejudice become her problem to bear. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," Jamila said softly, her eyes meeting Officer Taylor's. "It's hard to keep pushing forward when the world keeps telling you that you don't belong." Officer Taylor nodded, understanding in her gaze. "It's tough. I get it. I've seen families like yours fight for their space in a neighborhood, fight to make a life, only to be told they don't belong. And I know it can make you feel small, make you wonder if it's worth it." Jamila's chest tightened again, the weight of the truth settling over her. "But it is worth it, isn't it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've worked too hard to give up now." "Yes," Officer Taylor said, her voice firm with conviction. "It's absolutely worth it. What you're doing here, what you've built, is important. And don't let anyone make you feel like you have to apologize for that. You belong here just as much as anyone else." "Tara." The officer's words resonated deeply within Jamila. She realized that the shame she had been feeling wasn't hers to carry. The unfairness, the prejudice, those were not her burdens to bear. The weight of fighting for recognition and space wasn't hers alone. But that didn't mean she couldn't continue to stand strong, to press on. What she had built, what they had built as a family, was something to be proud of. She couldn't control the biases of others, but she could control how she responded. Jamila turned to Marcus, who was watching her with an understanding look in his eyes. "We'll keep going," she said softly. "We'll make sure our children know that they belong." that they are enough, no matter what anyone says. Always, Marcus agreed, his voice steady. Together, we've got this. And as the officer left, Jamila stood a little taller, the weight of her internal conflict now shifting. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to keep walking it, side by side with her family, surrounded by the strength they had within each other. It was a strength built not on avoiding conflict, but on facing it with resilience, dignity, and the determination to never let anyone define her worth. Because in the end, they did belong, and they weren't going anywhere. The days following the incident with Mr. Samuelson were a whirlwind of emotions for Jamila. The lingering discomfort of that day clung to her like a shadow, but Officer Taylor's words had planted a seed in her. She had held herself together in the face of injustice, had stood her ground without losing herself, and the reality of that strength was beginning to sink in. She hadn't just endured. She had triumphed, even in the smallest of ways. She had not allowed Mr. Samuelson's racism to define her family's worth, and now, she was more determined than ever to hold onto that sense of dignity. Jamila found herself reflecting more on the things Officer Taylor had said to her, the encouragement to keep going, the affirmation that they belonged. But there was also something deeper stirring within her. The way Officer Taylor had approached the situation, calm, collected, yet unwavering in her belief in fairness and justice, was a stark contrast to how Jamila had reacted in the past. She had always been quick to retreat, to play it safe, to protect herself and her family from conflict. But now, a new fire was burning inside her. She wasn't just going to let things slide anymore. She wasn't going to let injustice pass unnoticed. The next weekend, Jamila decided to take action. She had been quietly participating in the local community events, staying under the radar, never fully immersing herself. But the conversation with Officer Taylor had sparked something in her. It wasn't enough to just keep to herself anymore. She had a voice, and it was time to use it. That Saturday morning, Jamila called a few of the families in the neighborhood, including some of the black families who had faced similar issues with prejudice in the past. It was time to build something bigger. A community that didn't just stay quiet in the face of injustice but stood together. She wasn't going to wait for things to change. She was going to help make that change. The response was overwhelming. Families showed up, eager to speak out, eager to be heard. Jamila realized how much strength there was in numbers, how much strength there was in simply being seen. They gathered in the local park, children running around, adults chatting, and they began to form a collective of neighbors who were determined to make their voices heard. It wasn't just about confronting racism. It was about creating a space where people could truly belong, where every family, no matter their background, felt seen and valued. As Jamila looked around at the group of people she had brought together, she thought back to the way Officer Taylor had responded to Mr. Samuelson. It had been the perfect example of strength, not in confrontation, but in standing firm in your beliefs. It was the kind of strength Jamila now realized she had within her, too. She wasn't backing down. She was standing tall alongside her community. Later that week, Jamila went to the local community center to set up a meeting with the police department. She felt the weight of her decision to take that step, but something inside her told her that it was time to act. She remembered Officer Taylor's kindness, the way she had spoken with respect, yet had never wavered in standing up for what was right. It was time to build that same respect in the community, to show that no one was above accountability. When Jamila walked into the meeting room at the community center, Officer Taylor was already there, waiting. Her presence was as calm and confident as it had been when they had first met. Jamila could feel the nervousness in her stomach, but she pushed it aside. She knew what needed to be done. "Thank you for meeting with me," Jamila said, her voice steady. "I wanted to talk about what happened in my neighborhood. The way Mr. Samuelson handled things wasn't just a misunderstanding. It's part of a larger problem, and we need to address it. I want to work together to make sure this doesn't happen again." Officer Taylor nodded, her expression open and understanding. "I completely agree, Jamila. This isn't something that can be swept under the rug. It's a problem that needs to be addressed. And I'm glad you're taking the initiative to make sure it's heard." Jamila felt a sense of relief wash over her. Officer Taylor wasn't dismissing her concerns. She was standing beside her, validating her experience and offering her support. The conversation that followed was productive, filled with ideas for community outreach programs, anti-racism training for local residents, and a stronger partnership between the police and the neighborhoods they served. It wasn't an overnight solution, but it was a start, a meaningful one. As the meeting ended and Jamila walked out of the community center, she felt the weight of the world lift just a little. She had taken a small step, but it felt like a giant leap in the right direction. The world around her hadn't changed completely, but her mindset had. She wasn't just a passive observer anymore. She was actively shaping the future she wanted to see. Days later, Jamila decided to visit Officer Taylor, just to express her gratitude for the way she had handled the situation. She drove to the station, the memory of their first encounter still fresh in her mind. When she entered the station, Officer Taylor was at her desk, working. "Hey, I just wanted to thank you," Jamila said, standing in the doorway. Officer Taylor looked up, smiling warmly. "No need to thank me. I'm just doing my job." "You've done more than that," Jamila said, walking up to her desk. "You've given me the courage to stand up, to fight for the change I want to see in my community. I don't think I would have done it without your support." Officer Taylor smiled. "You're the one who made the change happen, Jamila. I just helped guide you. The real strength was always in you." Tears welled in Jamila's eyes, and she nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. The journey she had started was far from over, but now, she was walking it with purpose. She had learned that strength wasn't about doing everything on her own. It was about having the courage to ask for help, to stand with others, and to take action when the time came. As Jamila left the police station that day, she knew she was a different person. She had faced fear and injustice and had used it to fuel her determination for change. And in doing so, she had not only changed the neighborhood around her, but had begun a transformation in herself. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready to walk it. Not alone, but with her community by her side. The moral of it all: true strength comes not from standing alone, but from standing together, lifting each other up in the face of adversity. As Jamila sat on her porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange, she felt a quiet sense of contentment wash over her. The events of the past few weeks had been challenging, filled with moments of doubt and frustration, but they had also brought about something unexpected. A deep realization that change, no matter how difficult, was possible. She had stepped out of her comfort zone, faced her fears, and fought for something greater than herself. And in doing so, she had found her true strength. She thought about Officer Taylor's words, the way she had quietly but firmly stood by Jamila's side when it mattered most. "You're the one who made the change happen," Officer Taylor had said. Jamila had always thought that change was something that only happened in grand gestures, in big moments, but now she understood that it was the small acts of standing together, of speaking out, that made the most difference. It was the kindness, the empathy, and the willingness to fight for what was right that truly mattered. Her mind drifted to the gathering they had organized in the park, the way the neighborhood had come together in support. The strength they had shared was palpable. Families from all walks of life, coming together to be seen and heard. It was the beginning of something larger than just one family's struggle. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, everyone who had faced judgment based on nothing more than the color of their skin. It was a movement built on unity, on compassion, on the understanding that no one should ever have to fight alone. "Nam, are you okay?" Isaiah's voice broke through her thoughts, and she looked down to see him standing at the door, his eyes wide with concern. Kayla was behind him, her small hand clutching the doorframe. Jamila smiled, feeling a wave of love for her children. "Yeah, sweetie, I'm okay. More than okay, actually." Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "You're really proud of what you did, huh?" Jamila nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "I am, baby. And I want you to know that you can do anything you set your mind to. You don't have to fight the world alone. You have your family, your community. You belong here, and you have the power to make a difference." As Jamila stood up and walked toward them, she felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been hard, but it had shown her the true value of human connection. The strength to face injustice didn't come from standing alone. It came from standing together, lifting each other up, and never backing down. And with that, Jamila knew that the fight was far from over. But with love, courage, and unity, they could overcome anything.